Hey friends! So in this video today, I would like to walk you through an example where we migrate multiple single Angular CLI workspaces and consolidate them into a single Nx Monorepo workspace. So basically we start from a situation where you have kind of a polyrepo setup with different Angular CLI applications, and you want to basically group them together in a monorepo. Now the fact I'm choosing Angular CLI is just by coincidence. We could totally just also use a create React app setup or some other type of setup that you want to migrate into an Nx workspace. So let's see how that works. So when we speak about migrating from the Angular CLI, there's a pretty good article and guide on the nx.dev documentation, which goes through all the details. And this is a fully automated approach. So basically, by using and leveraging this ng add command and by adding the novel Angular package, there is an automation script in there, which allows you to automatically migrate and transform your current CLI workspace into an Nx workspace. And there's a couple of detailed descriptions on potential flags that you can pass for here, for example, preserving the Angular CLI layout if that's what you want to do. And also some more detailed description of what happens if you have a multi-project Angular CLI workspace. So this doesn't just work in the case where you have the traditional Angular CLI workspace with one application in there, but the Angular CLI gives you also the possibility to have basically multiple projects in there. And so this automated migration would work in that case as well. Similarly, for the create React app scenario, we have another guide which does a similar walkthrough, and it is also a fully automated setup. So you can just run npx create crr to nx, and that will also transform your file system and make sure you got a setup that works best for nx. There's also a video included here, so if you prefer that, feel free to go through that video. Now these guides mostly focus on when you have a single Angular CLI or create React workspace and you try to migrate that over. And the automation script we embedded in there do a pretty good job to automatically migrate you over, such that there's really just a very small fraction of things that you need to adjust or you might need to adjust. The thing, however, is that what happens or how do you do that when you have like multiple of these single polyrepos and you want to consolidate them? And this is a bit more of a manual approach or semi-automatic approach. And this is exactly what we want to do and find out today. So a good way to start is also to set up first an Nx workspace to have in mind what the end goal state should look like. And this is very handy because we can also copy over configuration files that got generated by such a new setup that we would also need in our manual migration. So I'm just going ahead and I create a new Nx workspace. And I call it also my org temp, and the preset will be Angular. And for the application name, let me actually choose project A so that we have at least like a similar project. And I would want to choose the very same setup that we might have in our end target that we want to achieve. So if we now open up this repository, we can see it gives us the structure that we would have in our final situation, where we have our projects migrated into this application folder, we have our libs folder, but more specifically, we have all the config down here. We have the nx.json and how it should look like in the end. We also have the tsconfig.json that we can reuse once we need that in our workspace, but also the package.json that might be needed, and specifically the whole dependency part, such as all the novel specific dependencies that we might need in a proper Angular setup for Nx. So I keep this setup on the side because from here and there, we might want to copy over some of the configuration files. But for now, let's go back to the initial setup where we want to start from. So I already went ahead and did the boring stuff by creating two Angular CLI projects here. I just grouped them in the same folder in this my org folder because like, this is what our Nx workspace or monorepo will look like in the end. So I just generated them inside the same folder, but you can see that they are auto-consistent. So they have everything that an Angular CLI application comes with. So there's the package.json, there's all the Angular CLI configuration. And so we can just like cd into each of these folders and run them. There's no connection among these, so these are completely separated and basically just co-located in this repo. Now to make things simple, these are already aligned with the current Angular CLI setup. And this is already one thing to consider and keep in mind. If you come from a polyrepo setup, those Angular versions might not be aligned. So it might make a lot of sense to actually first align them. And you can do that directly into this workspace by just migrating each app individually until you have basically the same version. This is not strictly required, but it gives basically the best experience afterwards as we start consolidating the workspace. And you can consolidate that already or step by step by basically running the migrations within the applications themselves. And you can also start doing it just for one app. So if this one is, for instance, migrated, and this is like the target version of the Angular CLI that you want to have, what you can actually do is you can move all of these dependencies out and move them to the root level. I have already here a root level package.json, which is simply the package.json for my monorepo workspace. So this will be the final one, which contains all the dependencies. And this is also one other thing. Our end goal is to have a default NX setup, what you would get if you run create NX workspace and set up a new Angular-based workspace. And by default, NX follows the single version policy, meaning that all of the packages are just installed and referenced at the root level, and then all of the other applications and libraries within the workspace point to those references. And this might seem or need kind of an initial mind shift if you come from a different type of setup. But in the long run, it gives a lot of the benefits because you never run into issues where you have two different Angular libraries you want to share and reuse in one application, but both of them use or require different Angular versions. That said, you don't necessarily need to go the full route. You can also have a setup where every application, every library have their own package.json and node modules. And you would use something like npm, yarn, or pnpm workspaces to actually make sure that the linking among those libraries happens, such that you actually get some benefits from a monorepo setup. NX totally supports that, and at that point, NX would simply be there to run the tasks in an efficient manner to provide something like computation caching or compute affected commands. Now, we still believe the best way is to go the full route and consolidate everything. So let's go ahead. So by having the dependencies now at the root level, what would happen with project B here is it would just try to find those dependencies higher up if they're not present in its own node modules folder. And so to do that, let me actually remove here the node modules folder. Let me cd into the ng project B, and let me do an npm install. You can see there's nothing to be installed because there's simply no dependencies defined because we moved them all to the root level. So that said, at the root level, we obviously need to install those packages. So with that, all of these packages, such as the Angular core, Angular dev kit, they now live in the root level of the monorepo, which is the final use case or the final goal that we want to arrive at. But still we can run our ng project B without any problems. So we can just cd into ng project B and then do an npx ng serve and run the application. And so you can see it runs, it shows us the normal entry startup page of that ng project B as it would normally with an Angular CLI setup. And similarly, we can also just run the ng project A, which would also still work. And now we basically serve ng project A here. So you can see from this example how we can actually now start slowly to consolidate those common dependencies at the root level and remove them from the individual project level. Now, obviously, this might need some more fine-tuning in a real-world scenario where you have also some external packages that you want to consolidate at the root level, and which might require some upgrades, for instance, in some libraries you have or in the specific ng projects. So at this point, we can even start moving this into more of a shape of how an NX workspace setup would look like. So we can create here the usual app structure, and we can start moving these two projects into that app structure. Similarly, we can also create a libs project here, which would then contain our library projects that we share among those applications in our workspace. At this point, we could even go ahead and add NX to it. Right now, we don't have NX installed here, so what we can do is just run NX init at the root level of the project, which would install a minimum setup of NX. Now note this npx NX init, you can do that on any type of npx workspace. And the main intention in this setup is that NX will simply function as your task scheduler and provide some of those caching features that might help you speed up the monorepo. So as you can see now here, we got the NX.json setup. It doesn't have any cacheable operations in here yet, simply because we don't know exactly how the workspace is being structured. and whether your build commands, for instance, are actually cacheable and don't have any side effects. Obviously, we also got Nx installed at the package level here, at the root level of our monorepo, and all you get is a single package that is called Nx here. Now for the cacheable operations, we could actually be safe and go ahead and say we want to have build and test and lint as the cacheable operations, because those are some of the default ones that we might also have in our Angular CLI setup. Now with Nx installed, we could actually already get a little of the benefit in the sense that we don't have to cd into every of these applications and run the local scripts. For instance, here for serving ng project A, we would go ahead and run this start script to serve it. But rather at the root level, we can say npx nx, and we would give it the start script here to run. Say start ng project A. Now what Nx here does is simply it understands automatically that there is ng project A and ng project B in this workspace. They have a package.json, and there are a couple of scripts that Nx can run in here. It doesn't go a level deeper and look at the Angular CLI JSON. So at this point for Nx, those projects are simply a black box. They could even be React projects or a Vue project or a Svelte project. But now we can see the application here is being served at localhost 4200. And if you go there and refresh, we see it still works as we expect. So the next step here in our project migration would be to add libraries. Now, ideally, what you would do is continue the migration of the application projects until you have them basically aligned with what a new Nx workspace will give you, and then you start actually sharing code among them. Now, the thing is, like in a real world scenario, many times you might already have some of those Angular libraries which you want to now migrate in this workspace. So let's simulate that approach. So since our end goal is to get an Nx workspace, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to generate already a publishable Angular library using the Nx generators. Now, if you have Nx console, that would be the way to go and generate such a library. The thing is, if I generate here a new one and I search for library, I get the Angular schematics, which would potentially be fine because we get an ng packager setup, which is exactly what we want to have in that library setup here. But to get the now specific generators, we can go a step ahead and install all of the dependencies which we need for that. As we mentioned earlier, we have generated this setup, which is kind of the end goal which you want to arrive at. So what I can do is I can just go ahead and copy the now related dependencies over. So first of all, I'm copying here the now Angular one, and I go to the root package.json and add it here to the dependencies. And then I go ahead and also copy over all the dev dependencies. Now I could just filter out the now CLI dependencies here. Since we already used the very same Angular version, I can actually just go ahead and override this and copy the entire one. The only thing I might want to pay attention at is that here we still use Karma, which on the other side we don't. So I want to probably still be a bit cautious and just copy them in here like this and then deduplicate them. So if I go up here, we can see that we have Nx already installed, so that is fine. TypeScript also matches the version which I would want to have, so let me deduplicate that as well. There's the build Angular, which is already there, the Angular compiler CLI, and here there's a comma missing. So basically now we have all the packages at the root level of our monorepo, which would kind of be the situation which we would want to end up in the end. So let me now install all of them. So once all of these are installed, we should now actually be able to generate such a new library, but now coming from the novel Angular generator. And so I'm creating such a new library in here. Let's call it shared UI. And let's see at a couple of options here. What we definitely want to do is make this library publishable. And I'll explain in a minute why that is the case. And I also probably want to have an import path for that library, which reflects what that library would be, like how that library would be imported within my workspace. Now, my org actually matches this one, but this would be the name of your organization, and shared UI would be the name of my library. Now down here you see the generator running in a dry run mode where it tries to actually create that library, and you can see it fails at the moment because it cannot find a tsconfig base. So let me actually go ahead and actually also copy that over from the final setup. So we have a tsconfig base here. So let me just grab the content and create here a new file, which is called tsconfig.base.json. and paste in everything that I copied over. So this is just a normal standard setup. It is still empty because the workspace we copied it from also doesn't have anything configured in there. So now let me try again. Let me go up here and change here some small detail. And so if we look at this now, we can see it is able to create that library in that shared UI part here. So let me run this, and now I will explain why we got this error and why we need a buildable or better publishable library to have in that libs folder here. So as you can see, we get now this shared UI library generated, and Nx complained during the generating part that there is no tsconfig base JSON here, because what it does, it maps basically the import path, so the kind of the npm scope, to a local folder. And for doing so, it needs the tsconfig to be there. The reason for that is that Nx manages the dependencies by not linking them via something that is called npm workspace or pnpm or yarn workspace, but it rather directly maps it using TypeScript. Meaning that in the end, what would happen is that it would directly consume from the sources of this library here. And there would also not be the need to actually create a publishable library that needs to be built first. Now, why did we create a publishable library though then, if Nx can already consume it from here? We are just not there yet. So our current setup has some individual separate Angular CLI based projects in here. And the only way to really share them is by actually referencing the package in the dependencies. So you would actually add the dependency to the shared UI package in here, just as if this would be an external package. The difference though is that with something like npm workspace, we can then link it to a local build output rather than having to go through the publishing step. So that's exactly what we're going to do. But first, let me comment these changes. So now that we have the library, let's actually try to put it into a shape where we can import it into this ng project A project here. So for being able to share it, as mentioned, what we need to do is we need to build it and we need to install it into this project. In addition, we don't want to publish it. So whenever npm finds in its project A here a dependency to that shared UI, which we'll add here in a bit, what would happen is that it would try to download it from some remote location, where it obviously doesn't exist. And so in order to be able to do that local linking, there exists a feature which is called npm workspaces. And you can check out the link in the description of this video for more information. But basically what you do is you go into your root level package.json and you set up such a workspace by adding a workspaces property here and by specifying the paths where such local packages live. Now in our case, it is in the apps folder. That's where our application lives. And then the next one would be the libs folder. So in this specific case, if we want to consume the build artifact of our library, we probably don't want to pass here the libs folder, but rather where the build output of that library is. Now, by default, an Nx specific setup, if we run the build here for the shared UI, it would create the output in the dist folder, libs, and then the shared UI. So this is what we would want to import and install into one of our projects and link it from there, because that is also what you would get if you download a project, an Angular package from an npm registry. As such, what we would want to do here is rather do something like linking the dist libs folder where the build artifacts live rather than the local libs folder where the actual source code lives. Now, this really depends on your setup. If you change the output of this libs folder to be a local one, so within that shared UI, you can actually just go ahead and add those paths to that workspaces. The important part is that npm is able to find them. Now, once we have set up that npm workspace, another thing that we should do is actually remove the node modules folders from all of these projects and reinstall them separately. So I'm even going ahead to remove the global ones. We can also remove that dist folder for now. And then at the root level of our workspace, we just install the npm packages again. So given that we now had this workspaces property in our package.json, npm already understood that this is no more a normal traditional npm setup, but it is a workspace-based setup. So you already can see that there is no node modules folder in these individual packages, but rather they are grouped and deduplicated at the root level. We can also see that if we go into the package log, that there is a differentiation between packages that are global, and it also recognizes those local packages and their current dependencies. So you can see how those dependencies are being linked here. Our project B doesn't have any because we already moved them to the root level. So there's no difference there. And then there's further node module-based packages that are linked in the package.json. So with that, we have already set up the main prerequisites of being able now to reuse and link that shared UI library and import it in our ng project A. So first of all, let's go in that shared UI and actually create a new component in here. And we can use again the generate command here from NX console, say component. Let's call this hello world. It will be installed here in the shared UI package. We probably want to export it as well, so that we can use it outside of this library, and the rest of it should be fine. So let's just run this command. And now basically in that shared UI package, we should have the hello world component. It's here denoted app hello world. We have the shared UI module here, which contains the references for it. It exports it as well. And we also have at the root level here that index.ts file, which is the entry part of our package, the export of the components. So we can also reference it directly in case we need to. And so with that, we should be able to import it. Now, to actually import such a package, as we mentioned before, we need to install it first. And so to install a package directly into a specific package here, we could obviously go ahead and just add it to the package.json. We can also leverage some of the npm workspace specific commands. And so we can go ahead and say npm install, give it the name of the package, which in our case here, let's double check in the package.json, is called my.org shared UI. And we want to install it as a dependency, as a normal dependency, because it's a runtime dependency. And we want to install it by giving the -w into the ng project A package, which is the one we have up here. And so now running this command, we actually get an error initially. And the reason here, if we scroll up a bit, is that it says it cannot find it in this registry. And the problem is because in our workspace setup initially, we pointed the workspace to be pointing to that dist folder. And so obviously we need to pre-build our library first. So let me actually go ahead and say npx nx build shared UI. This will now create that dist folder and create the shared UI output. And now we should actually be able to go ahead and install the package into our project A. And so by installing that in the project A JSON file in the dependencies, we should get our new package linked. It also comes with a version. However, in the local linking setup, we most probably always want to go with the latest. So I'm replacing here the version with a star. So with that set up, we can actually now go ahead into our application and just use the new module. So we can import here the module from my.org shared UI. And the name of the module should be shared UI module. So we'll link them here. And by having them linked, we can also then go ahead into the actual app component and use it. So let me actually remove this for now and just add app hello world, which is the component that got exported from the shared UI. And so now we have linked them. Let's actually go ahead and see whether we can still run them. So I use nx again to run the start script of our project ng project A. And so with that, we can go to 14200 and refresh, and you can see the component gets outputted here. So the linking properly worked. Now, one thing to notice here is that whenever we change something down in our module here in the shared UI, we also want to make sure that if we serve the app or if we build the app, that it actually also first builds all of the dependencies it has. Now, NX comes with a nice setup for doing that by specifying so-called target defaults. And now, if you have a new NX workspace, you get such a setup already out of the box, but since we did some kind of manual migration, we need to configure it by ourselves. And so what we want to specify here is that whenever we run the build target, we want to make sure that all the projects that it depends on, it also runs the build target. And I'm adding here that kind of symbol in front, which indicates that this should happen for all of its dependencies. And similarly, we want to probably also have this for the start script. So also in that case, obviously, if you run npx nx start to target the package.json start script of the ng product A library or application, it will also first build our shared UI and then run the application. So with this, we make sure that always a new, fresh, pre-built local version here exists in that dist folder. And so with this setup, one other thing that already works is the NX caching. And so if we, for instance, delete this dist folder and then rebuild our shared UI library, it would just build it normally. And so we get the output here in the dist folder again, restored. But if I delete it again and I rerun the command, you can see it already leverages the NX cache. And so this is already one big benefit that we get out of that. And the same thing also the NX affected commands would work. So if you want to learn more about that, check out the link in the description of the video. So far, what we have done is we basically created a setup where we have an npm workspaces based setup that allows us to locally link the packages here in that output folder. And so we can reuse them across our Angular CLI applications. So literally, we already have now a monorepo setup, which is basically just based on npm workspaces. Nx is added on top here for some additional capabilities, such as the caching that we have seen, or also for the fast task scheduling. But we want to go a step further. If you remember initially, in a traditional NX setup that comes with the more integrated and plugin-based configurations, you get a much nicer DX. So you don't have to pre-build the libraries to be able to use them. You can easily generate new libraries into your workspace and much more. So that's where we want to arrive at. So let's go ahead and check that out. So linking a library in a traditional NX workspace is pretty easy. The whole mapping has already happened in a tsconfig base, and so we have this one here. What we could actually do before continuing migrating this application is just create a new application in this workspace. So I can go ahead and generate a new application, which comes from the now Angular generator, and let's call this NX app. And so I run this. And what I get as a result here is in my apps folder, I get a new NX application pre-configured and set up for me. This already comes with the jest setup. This already comes with the correct mapping for pointing to the tsconfig base. So it is a full NX-based Angular application. We can also go ahead and just run this. So we can just do NX serve NX app. And so if you go to localhost 4200, we now see the NX application-based setup. If we now want to reference our shared UI library in here, we can actually just go ahead, similar to what we did in the other project, import the shared UI module here, reference it obviously in the Angular module, go to our application component here. Let me add here NX app as a title, just that we have a difference. And then let me add here app hello world. So if I now go here and refresh, we can already see that the linking worked just as we expected. So the interesting part is that we didn't have to pre-compile our library for this. So the dist libs folder is actually empty. And what NX does, it uses this path information here to resolve it over this tsconfig based JSON path mapping. And so it directly points to the index.ts file of the library and consumes it from the source. So in this setup, we don't actually need that whole npm workspace-based setup, but NX already does the mapping over the tsconfig. Now in this particular situation, however, you can now see how we have a mixed setup where our ng product A is still an Angular CLI project. It relies on this npm workspace-based setup to map the local library via its dependencies and install it basically by having it pre-configured and pre-compiled in that libs folder. So this allows for a more incremental migration where some of the application, in this case the NX app, is already an NX-based application, while some others are still in the phase of being migrated over to a fully functional setup. So now as the next step, how can we go ahead and migrate our Angular CLI-based projects to also become a similar setup such as this NX app? Now, one thing you could do is actually just go ahead, create a new NX-based app, so an NX app here, such that you get all the configuration files you need, and then basically copy over the source folder into that app from the original one, and also make sure that you copy over things like the Angular JSON config here into the project-specific config here. Now, this is a bit more of a manual work, and luckily, as we mentioned initially, there is already a way to migrate an individual Angular CLI application to an NX workspace in an automated fashion. So what I'm going to do, and let's take for instance the ng project A as an example, because it still has also all its dependencies in here, and copy that out and migrate this individually by using NX. So I'm going to identify this in my Explorer, in this case the Finder. I copy this application and let's move a level up into a different basically folder structure. Let's paste this in. And now let me migrate this project individually. So let me just open this up in a Visual Studio Code editor. So now that we have this open, this is a single Angular CLI project. So we just copied this out and we can actually go ahead and install the dependencies. Now, obviously what we get here is the npm installation cannot resolve that shared UI package because it doesn't exist in this repo. So for now, let's just remove this because all we want to do is really just get the dependencies installed. So everything that cannot be found, we can just remove it. Also because the goal is not to actually build here the project, so it should still work. So once we have set this up, now we can run the migration using the NX-based automation. So based on the documentation, we can just run this ng add command. So let me copy this. Now I don't want to necessarily preserve the Angular CLI layout, so I remove this one here and I can just run this. Okay, I now don't have the ng CLI installed globally, so let me prefix this with npx. And so as a result of this, what you can see is that it transformed our local Angular CLI workspace into an NX-based one. So we now have that exact apps folder with the project in it, with all the config files. It also preserved Karma, although Jest is, for instance, the default right now for NX. And it also created that project.json with exactly the configuration that we need in our final workspace. So we can now really go ahead and copy this folder and move that over to our original NX migration workspace. Now, one thing to note is obviously that you need to make sure that you integrate the package.json files here, because this is a new workspace setup, so I don't have any external dependencies. But if you have them, you need to copy them over into the final destination. So first of all, let me just go ahead and copy this one here, go over to our migration repository. I could potentially remove this one and just paste in the new repository that we migrated. And so now you see the project.json file here that is referenced. You see the source files which you just copied over. We don't have any package.json here anymore because that is now at the root level. And as mentioned before, if you had some external specific package.json files, make sure to integrate them here at the root level and copy them over. The specific local my.org shared UI package, we don't need to have that anymore because now it would use the same mechanism over basically the main tsconfig base mapping to resolve that location. So if we now go ahead and serve that app, Angular will go ahead and compile it. And then if in the browser we go to localhost 4200, we can see the app still serves and works. Now, obviously, copying this over and deleting it, make sure that first of all, you obviously have a clean Git history. You check whether everything got transformed in a proper way. In theory, things like assets and specific configurations should have been copied over and already transformed in the workspace where you migrated this with the Angular automation migration. And so with this situation, we now have two applications that have already been migrated to a full NX setup. And the next step would be just to go ahead, migrate also this project B. And at some point where you don't have any basically Angular CLI based setups, you could also then go ahead and clean up here in the package.json, the whole NPM workspace is set up, because all of the local packages would get resolved over the tsconfig based TypeScript path mappings. So I'll leave that to you to go ahead. Obviously, this was a walkthrough example created artificially. In a real world scenario, one of the things that complicate such migrations are usually external packages that you need to align. But more specifically, the hard work goes into first making sure that the applications are aligned with the same Angular versions and not have any conflicts there. So I hope this was helpful. Check out our description and links in the description for more details on NPM workspaces, how NX works, for instance, in addition to a PNPM workspace, and much more. See you next time.